Hello. Tonight we are going to look at 3 baffling unsolved crimes. If you enjoy the content, please leave a like and subscribe. I have also opened a Ko-fi page if you are so inclined to donate. The link will be in the description below. Number 1. Stephanie Stewart. On August 25th, 2006, at 9 p.m., Stephanie Stewart would call a family member for her nightly chat. Stephanie, who was a very active 70-year-old, worked as a seasonal wildfire spotter for Alberta Union of Provincial Employees. She was stationed at the Athabasca Tower, which is located 15 miles northeast of Hinton, Alberta, on the outskirts of Jasper National Park. Since fire spotters are alone for several hours in some of the most desolate areas, they are often required to call and do check-ins. This particular park had a routine check-in system that Stephanie was required to call in 3 times a day, with the first check-in being at 9 a.m. That morning, however, Stephanie did not check in. Her supervisor would call her several times, but the call would always be picked up with no answer. Before the person on the other end would calmly hang up, the supervisor's concern would continue to grow, because Stephanie had never missed a call in all of her years working there. He decided to go to the tower and check on her. Upon arriving, he spotted her truck. Feeling a little bit more relieved, he opened the door. He would report seeing an unattended pot of water boiling on the stove, as well as the phone cord that had been unplugged from the jack. Worst of all, there was no sign of Stephanie. He immediately called authorities. The RCMP would be on scene soon, along with emergency personnel, who at first believed it was an animal attack, due to the fact that some fur and scat was in the area. But after a conservation officer with Alberta Fish and Wildlife inspected the scene, he quickly ruled out an animal attack. RCMP's Major Crimes Unit would examine the scene in the cabin. They would rule out any medical event that could have confused Stephanie, causing her to get lost. They would say it was foul play, as they thought she had been murdered. But how did the RCMP come to this conclusion? Well, in addition to the pot of boiling water, police would notice a, quote, smear of blood, end quote, on the steps leading up to the tower, and inside they would discover a few things missing, mainly from the bed, where there was 2 pillows with blue covers, a burgundy sheet, and a Navajo pattern duvet. In addition was Stephanie's gold watch, which they were unsure if she had been wearing at the time of the incident or if she had set it somewhere. Stephanie was an experienced outdoorswoman who had spent 13 years working at that tower. It was highly unlikely that she just wandered off and got lost. They would eventually do an extensive ground, water, and air search. They even used infrared technology, and nothing turned up. The RCMP has stated there was forensic evidence at the scene. However, they declined to go into specifics to, quote, protect the integrity of the investigation, end quote. And in regards to the smear of blood that the investigators reported, well, there's been unofficial chatter about that. Although there was a small blood smear on the steps, according to unofficial reports, there was a significant amount of blood found in the tower. This would have no doubt been spotted by her supervisor, and he was probably the leaker, as the RCMP have never released any detail about the actual crime scene. The going thought seemed to be that she was later wrapped in the bedding and taken out and hid somewhere. But, with the massive search effort that was made, why was there no evidence found? How could someone pull off a crime against the victim so far off the beaten path? Well, there's actually a simple explanation for that. It turns out that she wasn't that far from civilization. Actually, the tower only sat 3 miles from the main road, and there was no lock gate blocking access in, meaning anyone could have drove down to the isolated tower and cabin. Adding to this perplexing question was the timing. Investigators had 2 viable theories. The first was that someone showed up that night, most likely after her 9 p.m. phone call to a family member, and spent the night with her. Whether she wanted them to or not is left up for debate. But the most likely theory, according to investigators, is someone showed up a few moments before her scheduled check-in with the supervisor at 9 a.m. The reason for this mainly comes down to that pot of boiling water on the stove. Detectives believe someone showed up while she was making tea or coffee, murdered her, and then possibly decided to rummage through the cabin when the phone calls started coming in from her supervisor, which panicked him and he had to leave. Or maybe there was a different reason. Maybe it wasn't a botched robbery, although the watch has never been found. Regardless, the supervisor would have showed up just minutes after the assailant left. But who would do this and why? Investigators could not find any known enemies of Stephanie, and they believed it was most likely a chance encounter. There's never been anyone named a suspect in the case, but there has been one key person of interest among online sleuths. That man is named Travis Vader. Vader, who is already serving a life sentence for the murder of Lyle and Marie McCann, who are both in their late 70s, was actually in the area at the time of Stephanie's disappearance. He is a drug addict with a history of arson, theft, and weapon charges. He actually killed the McCanns during a robbery west of Edmonton 4 years after Stephanie disappeared, and disposed of their bodies in the woods, and they have never been found either. But there's nothing to link him to the crime other than the fact that he was in the general area at the time. As far as how and why, theories diverge. One of the more prominent theories is that a burglar, perhaps Vader, thought the old cabin attached to the watchtower would be abandoned, allowing him for an easy quick score to go buy some more drugs. And then when he got there, he was surprised by Stephanie, whom he then murdered and stole her watch. And before getting to ransack the place, the phone calls started coming in. He quickly wrapped her up in a blanket and took her outside to the vehicle and sped off. Another theory that's sort of related to this is it's possible that two people met up to do a drug deal on this uninhabited back road, only to be interrupted by Stephanie, causing them to panic and try to silence her. After those two theories, it's really up in the air. Although she was never found, there is one positive that came from all this. The provincial government would add new safety features to its 127 lookouts. This included locked gates at the road access, fencing, steel doors with shatterproof glass, and reinforced locks. Brush was also cleared given an increased line of sight, along with staffers wearing radios, personal locator beacons, and panic buttons. The fire watchers now check in more frequently and are given covert radio codes that can be used to discreetly indicate that they are in distress. A $20,000 reward is available for information leading to the arrest of the person responsible for Stewart's disappearance. Number 2. Jodi Huisentruit. In the early morning hours of June 27, 1995, KIMT, a CBS affiliate in Mason City, Iowa, producer Amy Coons would notice that news anchor Jodi Huisentruit had still not arrived on set. Amy would call Jodi's apartment at 4:10 a.m., and Jodi would answer and say that she had overslept and was about to leave to the station. However, by 6 a.m., she still had not arrived. Amy would fill in for her on the show, and at 7 a.m., police would be called. The police would go to Jodi's apartment where they found her Mazda Miata still sitting in the parking lot. They would also find evidence that suggested a struggle had taken place near her car, which was only 12 feet from the door to her apartment. They would also find a slightly bent key, her red heels, a blow dryer, earrings, and hairspray, as well as blood on the side mirror. Law enforcement believed that she was putting her key in the door and unlocking it when she was grabbed, and that's what bent the key. They would also recover an unidentified palm print, a strand of hair, and drag marks in the pavement leading away from her car towards Kentucky Avenue. They would then speak to 3 neighbors who confirmed they heard screams at the time Jodi was leaving for work. In addition, another neighbor, Randy Linderman, spotted a white van parked with its front parking lights on, but headlights off, at around the same time Jodi went missing. He assumed the vehicle was running but could not be sure. The vehicle was parked in front of Jodi's apartment and it was facing the street. He did not see a driver or anyone inside the vehicle. He remarked that he only noticed the van because at first he thought it was a police vehicle. He would say in March 2019, quote, "I saw a white van parked in the parking area. Having gone down that road many times, I'd never seen it there before. If I had to say a time, I'd probably say 3:50 a.m., end quote. After calling the police later that day, they would determine that none of the residents in the apartment complex owned a similar van. Law enforcement would soon issue an alert for any vehicle matching the description. For 24 years, this would be the only reported sighting of that van, until 2019, when Scott Fuller for the Find Jodi podcast would report he came into contact with a woman claiming she also had seen the van. The woman wished to be anonymous, and it's unclear why she is just now speaking about being a witness. It's also unclear if she ever made a report to the police, or if it's just someone that contacted the podcast. Regardless, she would report on the same morning at around 4 to 4:30 a.m. she would hear a car door. It woke her up since it was a quiet street, and she had never heard a vehicle out that early before. She looked out to see a white or a light gray van on the street, but not in the parking lot, but parked on Kentucky Avenue where Jodi lived. She would hear another door close and assumed it was the van's rear hatch. When she woke up 2 hours later, the van was gone. It should be noted, however, the speculation about the van is just that, speculation. There's no evidence that the van had any connection whatsoever. And again, I'm taken from the Find Jodi podcast. Scott Fuller would say he has been told by people in the area that an electrician who did work for the apartment complex did own a similar van. So it's very conceivable that it was just him getting an early start to his day. Although, I have to say it is odd that whoever owned the van never heard about the alert and came to clear everything up. Meanwhile, inside Jodi's apartment everything looked fine except the toilet seat was found lifted and 2 wine glasses were found in the sink, leaving investigators to think a male could have spent the night with Jodi. The day before Jodi disappeared, she participated in a golf tournament with some friends and co-workers. It was then that she would mention to her golf partners that she was going to change her phone number the next day because of some, quote, nasty and naughty, end quote, phone calls. After golf, she went home and called her friend Kelly Torgeson in Mississippi, but Kelly was gone, so she spoke to her husband for a few minutes. He would report she was in good spirits and upbeat, like nothing was wrong. After that, she would go to friend John Van Sice's house to view a homemade videotape of her birthday party that he had arranged for her earlier that month. John was 22 years older than her and definitely cared about Jodi. John would also come up as police were processing the crime scene and acted in an erratic manner, while stating he was the last person to see Jodi alive, which was certainly strange. However, John would end up passing a lie detector test, which doesn't really mean much, but John would also voluntarily give a palm print to investigators, and it did not match the one on the car. He also had an alibi. Furthermore, he provided DNA to which they could never link to the crime. Although, there is some question just how much DNA they did recover from the crime scene. John would be questioned a few more times, and the police would even execute a search warrant for GPS data on his vehicle as late as 2017. However, nothing of value would come up from the search. The second person of interest to come up was a man named Tony Jackson, a man who is serving life in prison for a series of violent sexual assaults around Twin Cities, about 3 hours from Mason City, Iowa. He also lived just 2 blocks from the television station that Jodi worked at. He allegedly wrote a rap song about where Jodi's body might be found. It was also uncovered that he had bought a car the day before Jodi went missing. He was also said to have met Jodi twice, although he denies ever meeting her, and one witness would claim that the morning of the kidnapping, at 4:30 a.m., as she was jogging past the key apartments where Jodi lived, she was nearly hit by a vehicle speeding out of the parking lot. The vehicle she described matched the car that Jackson had just bought, yet it was all circumstantial evidence, and his DNA didn't match anything investigators had. Neither did the palm print. He was ruled out in 1999. With Jackson ruled out, and Van Sice mostly ruled out, police were left to wonder if it could have been a stalker, maybe someone that became obsessed with her after seeing her on TV. It turns out, almost a year prior to the abduction, Jodi had reported to the MCPD that she had been made uncomfortable by a person in a small white truck, although some reports mention a white van instead. She also confided in her friends and self-defense instructor that she was worried about an abduction, at one point even calling her mom crying about the truck that had been following her. Despite this, police have been skeptical about a stalker. Investigator Lieutenant Frank Stearns would comment in 2011, quote, "An obsessive fan? Would they wait around for an extra hour hiding behind a garbage dumpster and possibly being seen? I don't feel they would. We've got nothing showing that there was a stalker. No gifts, no cards, no phone calls," end quote. But in September 2020, a police report from October 8, 1994 was made public. The report was made by an officer who responded to Jodi's calls about being followed by a white truck. The report reads, quote, "Huisentruit requested to talk to an officer in reference to a subject who was following her, driving a small white newer pickup," end quote. To add more confusion to all this, in 2008, Jodi's personal diary would be leaked to the press when someone sent photocopies to the local paper. It would come out that the leaker was the former police chief's wife, who confirmed that he had kept a diary at home for years. No one knows exactly what the motive was for this, and it would only get weirder in January 2020, when a billboard in Mason City would be posted looking to spark new information about the case. That's when a strange thing happened. Someone would vandalize the billboard with spray paint, and they wrote, quote, "Frank Stearns, Machine Shed," end quote. This wasn't the first time Stearns' name was muddied over the case. At one point during the investigation, Maria O., A former investigator on the case was fired for claiming she was given a tip by numerous sources that implicated Frank Stearns of being involved in the murder, but nothing ever came from the claim, although O would win a lawsuit for being wrongfully terminated by the police department. One thing that pretty much everyone agrees on was that the investigation was botched from the beginning. In 2018, in an interview with 48 Hours, Chief Brinkley confirmed that the car was turned over too quickly, and that there could have been evidence in the car that current technology could have taken advantage of. So where does the case stand now? As of 2019, new lead investigator Terrence Prohaska would say, quote, "I have a person that I believe is responsible for Jodi's disappearance. I'm not going to disclose that to anyone until I'm there to put the handcuffs on him or her," end quote. The case is ongoing and has picked up steam in the past few months. Police are hopeful for a resolution this year. Number 3. The I-70 Killer. On April 8, 1992, Jeff Mayrose of Indianapolis, Indiana, would go into the MAB paint store which he managed. He would be the first witness to see a notorious serial killer that would torment the Midwest for the next 29 days. Stretching over 1,200 miles, the serial killer would end up killing 6 victims and men suspected and at least 3 more, plus 1 attempted. Jeff would first see the man in a green jacket walking down Pendleton Pike. Jeff, quote, "He looked like a guy that had been sleeping in his clothes," end quote. Speaking with reporters in 1992, he would go on to say the man was carrying a long bag which made him assume he was a hitchhiker. He came from the direction of I-465, which intersects with I-70. The man would stop at Jeff's store, then repeatedly circle around the building before sitting on a curb nearby. Mayrose said the man remained there for a half an hour or more, staring at the Payless shoe store across the street while digging through his bag. Jeff would say he was, quote, "talking to himself and giggling. I'm telling you, he was either on drugs or he had mental problems," end quote. Jeff would go on to say the man disappeared around 2 p.m., but a little later he would catch a glimpse of the man calmly trying to hitch a ride north, back towards I-465. Meanwhile, Robin Foldauer was working in the shoe store alone. She was 26 years old, and was only working because she was covering someone's shift who called in sick. It would be around 3 p.m. Her body would be discovered in the back part of the store in the storage room. In that 1 hour period after leaving the paint store, the unknown killer would start his campaign of terror. Authorities were able to figure out that she had been murdered execution style. Less than $100 would be stolen from the register, a very small amount for such a horrendous crime. Just 3 days later, at a bridal shop in Wichita, 23-year-old Patricia Smith and 32-year-old Patricia Majors would be murdered. The store normally closed at 6, but they had told a male customer they would stay over so he could pick up his item. The killer would arrive, and the women would think it was the customer, and they allowed him in. He would kill them, again execution style, and again stole only a small amount of money. This was the only case where there was more than one victim. At about this time, the actual customer arrived, to which the perp told him to go to the back, but the customer refused, which no doubt saved his life. The killer allowed him to leave the scene, and he drove off and then called the police. There's some conflicting reports here, as some accounts say the man waited a full hour to report the incident to police because he was scared, still in shock, while other accounts say he immediately went to the police. Regardless, he was able to give a description of the man, who was a slender, white man with reddish or sandy blonde hair, stubble beard, thin lips, and lazy eyes. He was 5'6" to 5'9" and 150 pounds, in his 20s to 30s. He was neatly dressed and clean cut. He also described the man as being in a, quote, trance, or like, quote, he was thinking of something else, end quote. He also noted the man carried a Uzi-type gun. 2 weeks later, on April 27th, Michael McCown was working in his mother's ceramic store in Indiana, when the killer would come in and kill McCown and steal his wallet, which had less than $50 in it. Michael was the only man murdered in this spree. It is theorized the killer only went into the store, called Sylvia's Ceramics, because it had a female name, and the killer was expecting a female clerk. It was originally reported that Michael had long hair that he kept in a ponytail, and investigators believed Michael was kneeled down stocking shoes when the killer came in and shot him from behind, possibly thinking he was a woman. But in recent interviews with Michael's family, they have claimed this was incorrect, and that Michael had short hair at the time of the murder. Another week later, on May 3rd, Nancy Kitzmiller would be found dead at another footwear shop in St. Charles, Missouri, by customers at 2:30 p.m. and was immediately linked to the killer. A passerby, who was Nancy's last customer, would note that the man was a medium height and dull red hair. The last official murder would take place only 4 days later in Raytown, Missouri, as Sarah Blessing would be murdered in her gift shop. The murder occurred during the day, and this time there were witnesses. At 6:30 p.m., an auctioneer saw a mysterious unidentified man walk in and out of her store suspiciously. The nearby video store clerk would also see the killer enter, hear a pop, then see the killer leave. The video store clerk would also say the man hung around the shopping center for a while that day, and he was mumbling to himself, just like Jeff Mayrose had reported. A clerk at the nearby grocery store would see the suspect climbing back up the hill to the I-70 highway, and that's where his name comes in. Every murder was right off of I-70, and usually at a strip mall, at slow times of the day. The victims all bore similar characteristics outside the lone male victim, that being the victims were usually petite young women with long dark hair. And outside the Wichita murder, all the victims were alone, and since none of the victims were sexually assaulted, police speculate that he was a thrill killer, and using robbery as a second motive. And all the victims worked at small shops near the interstate, mostly business with just an employee or two. And the murder weapon was also sort of uncommon. It was believed to be an Intratec Scorpion or Irma Work Model ET-22. No suspects have ever been named publicly, but law enforcement believes the man traveled the route either because of his job, such as a traveling salesman, or he may have even been a hitchhiker. Or he could have just been in those areas because he had family there. The latter got more attention once it was realized by investigators that every murder took place within the vicinity of a small residential area. Police checked registrations from every hotel along I-70 during the time frame. They also checked tow booths, license plates, traffic stops, and yet never had one solid lead. There are 3 other murders, and one attempted, of store clerks that many investigators believe are linked to him. The 2 murders would happen in 1993 in Texas, while an attempted murder would happen in 1994. And finally, a 2001 murder that would take place in Indiana. The first murder in 93 happened on September 25th in Fort Worth at an antique store when 51-year-old Mary Ann Glasscock was killed. Then again, on November 1st in Arlington, when 22-year-old Amy Vest would be shot to death in a dance apparel store. The lone surviving victim, assuming it was the I-70 killer, was 35-year-old Vicki Webb, who would be shot in a gift shop in Houston on January 15th, 1994. She briefly talked to the shooter before he shot her in the back of the head. The bullet did not penetrate, though, due to a large vertebrae being hit. The killer attempted to shoot her again, but his gun misfired, and he left, presuming Webb was dead. Although the MO was very similar, and the murders took place with a .22, a ballistics test determined that it was not the same gun as the one used in the I-70 killings, leaving investigators with no way to 100% verify that it was the same killer. The last murder that may be connected is the 2001 Terre Haute murder of liquor store clerk Billy Brossman. It happened on the evening of November 30th, 2001, when Billy was working alone. Security camera footage showed a white male suspect enter the store, pull a gun on Brossman, and rob the cash register. The footage then showed the suspect lead Brossman to the back of the store and murder him with a single shot in the back of the head. The murder of Brossman occurred just 7 blocks from the murder of Michael McCown, and had a similar MO to the I-70 murders. However, unlike the I-70 murders, there was security footage here. But it would take 20 years for investigators to name the I-70 killer as a possible suspect in the murder, and that's because in November 2021, a task force to catch the I-70 killer would be launched. It consisted of the FBI, ATF, Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, Terre Haute Police Department, St. Charles Police Department, and Rayton Police Department. And after only a short few months in April 2022, the task force would announce they collected touch DNA from a bridal veil and the pants pocket of Michael McCown. The case is currently very active, and hopes are a name could come soon. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. But I want to know what you think. Do you think they'll ever catch the I-70 killer? Do you think he's even alive at this point? And what about Stephanie Stewart? What happened to her at that watchtower? And finally, what about Jodi Huisentruit? What happened to her in that parking lot? Please let me know what you think in the comment section down below.